We've seen these old songs, I call them that. Some of them 200 or better years old, some of them 100. But the lessons in these songs are powerful. Often the songs we sing, the lessons are directed at us. And the young folks, their music, they are more praise songs that's directed more to God. That's good. Let the Lord light be burning in the me across the way. Some poor babe, struggling seaman, you may rescue brother. Some poor sailor in his soul, trying now to make the harbor in the darkness vain. It asks us a question, still directed at us. Are you sowing the seed of the kingdom, brother, in the morning, bright and fair? Are you sowing the seed of the kingdom, brother, in the heat of the noonday's flare? For the harvest time is coming on, and the reaper's work will soon be done. Will your seed be made? Will you garner any for the gathering at the harvest time? Are you sowing the seed of the kingdom, brother, in the still and solemn night? Are you sowing the seed of the kingdom, brother, for a harvest pure and wide? For the harvest time is coming on, and the reaper's work will soon be done. Will your seed be made? Will you garner any for the gathering at the harvest home? Are you sowing the seed of the kingdom, brother, all along the fertile way? Are you sowing the seed of the kingdom, brother? You must be at the heart's great day. For the harvest time is coming on, and the reaper's work will soon be done. Will your seed be made? Will you garner any for the gathering at the harvest home? Please mark your books to 915, hymn number 915. All right.
Yep.
Got my red part of that, but before we get going on it. Predestination. When you hear the word, what do you think?
If I'm saved, why should I go to church?
If I'm saved, why not should I go to church? That's a good point. But what does predestination mean in general sense?
Something has been predetermined.
That's a good word.
And you got a place you're gonna land.
You got a place you're gonna land. Okay. In all honesty, predetermined would probably be a better word used when we look at it. Predestination means that it was previously determined what your destiny would be. And in that aspect of it. But that word being used the way it is in the Bible doesn't mean that. In that aspect. Okay? Now, what it does mean, there are things that God predetermined would happen. Okay? Now, on the flip side of that, it does not mean because he used them that he forced people to make certain decisions. And we're going to show that. Now, as those, and this is an interesting point, that call themselves free will Baptists, those type of Calvinists and predestination, it means literally this, that to them it means that God, before he created anything, said, I'm going to save you, 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 you. Everybody else is on their own. And we're going to look at some things with it. And that's part of the fallacy. Now, here we've got Calvin's commentary on Ephesians 1 and verse 4. And the reason I only have verse 4, because if I went through all the verses from 3 to 6 that this applies to, well, I could do a Paul sermon till midnight and we would only discuss Calvin's commentary. But this puts it in a nutshell. It fits it pretty well. So it's really all we done. Now notice he says, according as he hath chosen us, which is quoting verse 4. The foundation and first cause, both of our calling of all the benefits which we receive from God is here to
You say, is that fair or not fair?
That's where we'll get into it. But right now we're talking about what Calvin teaches.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay? This is Calvin's commentary. This is where the idea of predestination, the teaching of predestination, is brought about. It's through Calvin. That's why I'm using his commentary. Okay? Now he goes on to say, the very time when the election took place proves it to be free. Now, how many of us have heard of God's people being go as God's elect? Okay? Now we're having a kind of an ongoing election. Well, the early voting ended yesterday, but still election going on. What happens in an election?
People try to get elected.
People try to get elected. Who elects them?
People.
Other people.
Somebody.
Okay? That's where the problem we get into. We think of it as elected. There's two things that happen. I can elect to do something, or somebody can elect me to do it. You understand the point? In a way, those running for president can say that we were chosen because we were worthy. No, that part is wrong. But what about the second part? Because God foresaw that we would be worthy. Or rather, let's face this. God foresaw that we would choose and strive to obey Him. Does that make a big difference in it? Okay? Now notice, and here's one of the things it hinges on. We were all lost in Adam, therefore we had not God through His own election. See, it hinges on original sin, which we talked about last 2 weeks. If you take out original sin, what happens to this decision, belief here? Because according to Calvin, original sin brings up this point. There was all rescued us from perishing. There was nothing to be foreseen. Basically saying, if He had not rescued us, there would be nothing to be foreseen. In fact, he makes this point, same argument used in the Epistle of Romans, where speaking of Jacob and Esau, he says, for the children having not yet born, neither have done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of Him that calleth. The context there is dealing with the point of explaining that basically everyone's innocent until they make a choice, which ironically proves everything Calvin is saying is wrong. But what he's taking is this one verse to try to say, see, well, if they hadn't been created, they couldn't do good or evil. So how could God foresee what anybody would do? So you really got to take foreknowledge out of it. Here's the final point. But though they had not yet acted, might a sophist of the Sorbonne reply, God foresaw that they would act. This objection has no force when applied to the depraved natures of men in whom nothing can be seen but materials of destruction. What does Calvin call that?
Total
depravity. Okay, now what happens if you take out total depravity?
There's hope.
There's hope. Not only that, it takes predestined totally out of it. Well, the thing that he's objecting to, that God foresaw they would act, if you take out total depravity, it says man has a choice to act.
Yeah, that's the first principle in this line.
Yeah, that's the first principle of the two.
Involves the whole thing.
Yeah. And that's the thing. So in this point of kind of as our introduction, is the idea that Calvin had that man was totally depraved. Man could not choose to do anything good on his own. The Spirit has to come upon him, has to force him into doing that, and has to be God's choice. And God predestined certain people to be saved. They had no action in the matter whatsoever. Before we get started, I want to bring up a man by the name of John Raccoon Smith from Kentucky. Late 1800s preacher. Raised in the Free Will Baptist Church. Was a preacher for Free Will Baptist doctrine. Had been taught, and now you need to understand something. When a Free Will Baptist says free will, he is talking about God's free will. That grace is given by His free will. We have no free will.
It's very confusing.
That's very political.
Very political, very confusing. John Raccoon Smith said it bothered him from the time he was a child. And the thing of it is, one reason they would vote on whether or not you were saved, you had to witness to them what you had happened to you by the Spirit coming upon you to change you. And then they would decide whether they agreed it was the Holy Spirit coming upon you and baptizing you in the Spirit. And then after your voting, they would baptize you. Now this always bothered him, and he finally came to the point, he says, if a man chooses to do evil after the Spirit has come upon him, would God still then save him? Because part of that is, once you were saved, you were always saved. Because God had determined it. And on the other side, he said, if a man is doing all he can to try and do God's will, but the Spirit never comes upon him, is God still going to allow that man to be lost? Now, this was on a Sunday morning that he got up to preach. And he said, brethren, I am at a loss. And I will not preach another word until I have an answer to this question. And it took him 6 months. And when he got done, he was preaching biblical doctrine. He converted most of that church. Here's where we go. What we have to understand is God's use of foreknowledge. In Romans 8:29-30, it says, for whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he did predestinate, them he also called, and whom he called, them he also justified, and whom he justified, them he also glorified. Foreknowledge. Foreknew. How much is God working in our lives? I want you to notice the point. Start. Whom he foreknew, or foreknown. What does that mean?
But it says for him, for whom he did foreknow.
For
So
whom he did foreknow.
those he did. So that suggests some that he don't.
But it really doesn't.
It leaves it
Okay, if
open,
God is all knowing,
but it leaves open
It
for
leaves
some
open
that
for
he did and
those-
some he didn't.
that's right, it leaves it open.
Not that
but-
he didn't know them, it's whether he did or he didn't.
The time. God is not restricted by time. That word shouldn't be foreknow, it should be just know.
Well, and I understand that, but the writer is trying to relate it to element time, because you gotta go back before this foundation world. And see, sometimes we forget that. Did God know everything before anything happened?
Yes.
Okay, so you gotta look at that point. What he knew before time began. That's where this is really talking about. Okay,
But that's a time.
it is a time word.
Word for us and not for God.
That's right. It does, like, and that's part of our problem, because what do we see?
We start restricting God because of time.
And I understand, but how do we see time?
Linear.
Literally, we see it each day as an act. How does God see time?
Present.
He doesn't. And that's what foreknowledge is, pre-knowledge, before time. We have to use it that way because we are linear beings. And we have to understand how God did it, even though time has not yet unfolded completely. Does that make sense?
All except the part that we have to figure out how God did it. Because we-
Well, if we don't, then we're opening up to false teaching. We have to look at things as what we do. If we don't understand the mind of God, how do we understand this point?
Well, it might be better that you just have an example.
Well, we're getting there. Okay?
Because, you know, this is one of those, you just hand this to a lot of people, they will be confused.
Right, but we gotta open with this part and then we get the explanation. Okay?
I'm just, because, you know, the Bible is written for everybody to understand it, or for the general public to understand it, so it shouldn't take a, you know, a theological.
But if we get into deeper subjects, then you're gonna have to get into deeper understanding.
Right, but an example's always good.
Man, we're going there. I got several of
One
them.
of our problems trying to deal with God's foreknowledge is the same problem we got with trying to understand eternity or no time. We can't really wrap our minds around that. We can't, you think you might know about eternity, no time, but you don't. Everything in our life is regulated by time. And as a consequence, we have a little trouble with foreknowledge or after knowledge, any way you want to look at it. See, it's like time is with them, there ain't no past, present, and future. And so all this foreknowledge, that's putting time on it.
That's right,
So
because
we
why?
kind of halfway,
There we go. Exactly. We have to put time into it because we're linear beings.
right, for God it's now.
For God, well, for God, all of it is now.
It's now, it's all now.
But God speaks of it, and He puts it in linear time in hopes that we can understand it.
I don't know, there's just always, there's so much calling that occurred in the Bible and so little listening. And, you know, God, you know, he gave a lot of people an opportunity, but he knew which ones were gonna say yes.
And that's what this is talking about. This verse is talking about He foresaw before the foundation of the world who would respond to it.
And he asked.
That's His truth.
Who's
And
the
and this is what He's saying here. So those that He saw that would be willing to be conformed to the image of the Son, He made sure that they got the calling. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But on that last paragraph where it says, Bill, he also called and whom he called. He calls everyone. Everyone is called.
But this is talking about a particular group.
In Christ.
Those in Christ, those that would respond. Well, when Paul finishes this, in fact, the previous verse says, we know that the things that work all things work for the good of those who love the Lord. That's Romans 28:28. The verse after this says, then if God be for us, who can be against us? If God brought us to this place, who's going to go against us? That's his point Paul is making. If God has brought you here, what can man do to you?
Well, the very first verse that you mentioned, he chose us in him. That's the group.
Yeah, the group. He chose us in him. So the context is dealing with a particular group, and it's people who basically would choose to obey the Lord. It's a realization that we need to understand. The point that he calls everyone to repentance in Acts 17:30 is true. How many listen to the call? Or respond positively. Let's put it that way. So those that respond positively end up conforming themselves to the image of Christ. And so the reality comes back is God is going to make sure that those people get called. We don't sometimes like the idea that God intervenes so much in his life, but I'm more and more thinking that God's providence is working daily.
I think a lot of times about, Jacob and Esau. So Jacob, he goes there, and this father who was kind of no good gets blessed because of him, because he's working for him.
Laban?
So he's working for him, and he just keeps getting blessed by being there. Well, that was also, it ended up being a blessing to Jacob. But somebody that wasn't very good was getting blessed. They didn't even realize it.
Well, in fact, in the end, because of the way they were doing things, what happened to it?
He didn't even want him to leave because he knew he was being blessed.
Well, and the thing of it is, when he left, he was basically broke and made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my stubs as being yet unformed. And in your book, they were all written the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. What does that talk about? Before the foundation of the world. And God had seen everything. Now, did he predetermine that it would happen? Or did he predetermine certain parts would happen? So that goes back to that point of getting called. God is going to ensure we get called. He's going to use his providence. And I think that sometimes the word we leave out of all this is God's providential nature.
Man, I would look out in the eye and see they're crazy.
Well,
I don't need it.
Here's what I would look at him even at, and when I asked one person years before when I was in high school and knew none of this, I asked him, how's that just? If God is just, how is it just to condemn one man and save another when they had no say in the matter? Because basically what Calvin has done is made us all robots. And guess what? If that be true, whose fault was it Adam sinned? When he says that woman you gave me caused it, God, it's your fault, he'd be right. If God programmed Adam and Eve to sin and they didn't have a free decision in it, God's no longer a just God. The point of this, it tells us straight up that God knew things beforehand. The things are written, he knows what's going to happen. Just because he knows what is going to happen didn't mean that every person was programmed to make a decision. Let's take Judas for an example. He betrayed the Lord. How many years was he listening to the preaching of the Lord? 3.5, roughly, yeah. Okay. How many other people heard all that preaching? 11 others. More than that, actually.
Yeah, more than that.
But, well, I mean, we know there was a group, because that all group was all gathered, and they picked two to choose between to take Judas's place. And then it said they had to be there from the beginning. Okay? That was one of their rules in Acts chapter 1, one of the things that get possible. So, but let's keep that 11. 11 chose to keep following, one chose to betray him. If man has no free will and God calls him to do it, where's the justification for Judas?
What do you mean, where's the justice?
Where's it just to condemn Judas?
If he was free.
If he was predetermined that he would betray the Lord, how is it just when he was programmed and formed?
Uses Judas as an example to prove this point too, the fact that he was talked about in Psalms as being the one that would do it, and so he's saying that Judas didn't have a choice because it had already been predetermined that he would be the one.
And there's a good example in Daniel concerning that. In Daniel chapter 4, where you think Daniel wrote it, and he probably did write it down, transcribe it per se. But according to the end of the chapter, it's Nebuchadnezzar that recorded it all. And before Nebuchadnezzar went cuckoo, so to speak, God sends him a dream, and Daniel warns him in the dream that if he continues down his path, here's what's going to happen to him. What's good as a warning if you can't change your mind?
When they need the warning.
And guess what? The warning is the justification for what happened to him.
Same way with Nineveh and Jonah.
Nineveh and Jonah, they had a choice. You brought up Pharaoh in Exodus 9. 34, when Pharaoh saw that the rain, the hail, and the thunder had ceased, he sinned yet more, and he hardened his heart, he and his servants. So many people talk about God hardening Pharaoh's heart, but yet every one of those plagues it says about Pharaoh hardens his heart. At times God says, I have hardened his heart. How did God harden Pharaoh's heart?
By using the plagues.
By using the plagues. But who chose to harden his heart?
Pharaoh.
Okay? Now, did God know ahead of time? Yeah. Let's look on here. Let's look at Abraham real quick as we go forward. Now, when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, hard, great darkness fell upon him. Then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. Do we know that to be true? And also the nation whom they serve, I will judge. Did God do that? Afterward, they shall come out with great possessions. Do we see that unfolding? Now, as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. But in the fourth generation, now here he counts the generation as 100 years. They shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Foreknowledge, justice, predetermination. All right there in that context. I have determined, Abraham, that I will give you this land. But I will give it to your descendants. Predetermination. Foreknowledge. 400 years from now is when I'm going to do it. And your people will be in a foreign land. And when they leave, they will have great possessions. Judgment. I will judge that land And I'm judging this land at that time, because the Amorites are not yet complete in their iniquity. You know what he said? It would be unjust for me to give you this land now, to take away from the Amorites, because they have not yet turned to complete iniquity. But by then they will be so far away from me, it'll be just. That may,
And that's what we see when God makes promises in the Bible, like that one that he made to Abraham. It didn't depend upon Abraham one bit. That's an unconditional promise. It was going to happen.
but if I was
Whether Abraham did anything about it or not, it was going to happen.
and it was
But
made
then there was
Abraham's
other
faith.
promises, like the one that he made to David, that the ruler would come from his blood. David didn't have a choice in that. Jesus was going to come from David's lineage. That's what God said. But now Solomon, he said, if your sons obey me, that's a conditional promise. Now that depends upon the man.
Now, you got two things going on there. One, David's promise he made to David was on the point of that the king, the Messiah, would come through his loins. The one he made to Solomon was all about his sons remaining faithful, and that if they would stay faithful, there would never fail to be one of them on the throne of Israel.
Right.
How long did that last? There's the point of it. Like you said, one was unconditional, but it was going to be God's work, and the other one was conditional.
Calvin doesn't make that distinction.
No, he doesn't. Now, here's one thing. See, what do we tend to define providence as?
How do we define providence?
How do we tend to define providence?
Love.
Luck?
Oh.
Huh?
Completely unknown.
Completely unknown?
We know it works, but we don't know anything else about it.
Here's the definition I've always heard is providence is when God indirectly works in your life. It's not a good definition. We'd have a better understanding if we saw it as there are times that God miraculously works in our lives and times that he non-miraculously intervenes in our lives. I firmly believe that Casey and I are together through that non-miraculous working. Did others play a role in it? Yeah. Other people made decisions that put us in that position. But God used that. Now here's a point, the reason I'm saying it. Here's an example of God miraculously working a little bit and non-miraculously working. When you go back to Joseph's brothers, you got to understand, first of all, look at verse 4. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more, speaking of Joseph, than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Here's the first thing. What do? They hate him. That's already in their heart. Now, notice, now it tells us, now here's where God starts miraculously intervening. Now, Joseph had a dream and he told it to them. They sold business. No way was he going to work for me. See that point? Now, then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brother, said, look, I had dreamed another dream. And this time the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down to me. So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him, said to him, what is this dream that you dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in hand. So how they hated him before, how do you think they feel about him now? Now I want you to think back, what did God tell Abram? Your people slaves for 400 years in a foreign land. Now, when they saw him afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. This is how bad they hated him. And they said to one another, look, this dreamer is coming. Come therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit, and we shall say some wild beast has devoured him. We will see what will become of his dreams. Okay? Non-miraculous intervention. Who speaks up? Reuben. We can't kill our own flesh and blood. Get some, put them in a pit. Plan to come back later and rescue him. Well, what happens while he's gone? Man, the Ishmaelites come on. God says, watch this. Hey, you guys come along this way. Because old Judah, he's going to have a thought. Let's sell it. It makes a profit. Huh?
That's what Jews are all about.
That's what Judah was all about. Until he goes to Egypt. It's interesting there. Look at the life of Judah. Something. Look at that change that happens to him from Genesis 38 down to about 43, 44. See? God miraculously working, giving Joseph those dreams. Dreams which did come true in Egypt. Non-miraculously having Joseph there where they throw him in a pit, Reuben speaking up on his life, for his life, but yet while Reuben's away, sending that group of Ishmaelites to sell him to, making sure that Potiphar buys him, knowing that woman's going to accuse him of false things, letting him be cast into prison, preserving his life because he should have been killed for what he was accused of. Preserving his life in prison, letting that baker and that butler be passed in prison by Pharaoh, using him to interpret their dreams which came through, giving Pharaoh a dream later so that Joseph could interpret it and be rised up to second only to Pharaoh, allowing the famine to come, having made allotment for all that feast, to where when his brothers are starving in Israel, would be sent down to grant grain, keeping Simon, so that they have to come back a second time and bring Benjamin. And Joseph seeing the change in his brothers and finding out that his father's still alive and reveals himself to him, and the whole nation, so to speak, is brought down to be saved. All right.
In all of those examples, though, if you look at it, everybody involved in all of those things still had a choice to make, and they chose of their own free will. They were not compelled to hate him. They were not compelled to ship him to Egypt. So you can't read the Bible and say that you don't have any choice in it.
No, they had all the choice. They had all the choice. They made it. And you're right. And that's why we're looking at this, because it shows God's use of foreknowledge and providential care, but yet allowing man to make his decisions, but knowing the outcome. And that's where God uses our nature. He gave them the dreams so that he would reveal the dreams to them, so that they would make that decision. But here's the thing, they always had a choice. Look at James chapter 1. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. For each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire was conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, brings forth death. this right here denies Calvinist predestination. Because this says we have free will. God may allow us to be tempted, but we always have an opportunity to do what's right. Out of those 11 brothers, there was actually one trying to do what was right. Guess when Joseph finally found that out? Back up a little bit. That first time they go down to Egypt, and when he is sitting there and they don't know it's him, and he's telling them, and Reuben says, I told you to do no harm to the boy, and now look, it is coming back upon us. And it tells us that Joseph went secretly and wept. Right then he knew I had one brother that was fighting for me. And he was trying to do what was right.
He would have grown a lot through the experiences that he had.
Oh,
And his love of God would have gave him the love for his brothers, no matter what they did.
yeah, but he would kind of question what to do about them when they first came down. He didn't openly say, hey, I'm your brother Joseph. You remember that dream? Well, here I am. He was.
But he was more questionable, wanting to know what was going on with Dad.
Well, what Dad, what's happened to Benjamin, but at the same time, what kind of people are you? And he sees a lot of things. And Judah, he sees a lot in. You talk about his growing, Judah did a lot of growing. But that's the point there. Making these points. Notice Jeremiah, he says, and the word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you, or ordained you a prophet to the nations. Then said I, Lord God, behold, I cannot speak, for I am a youth. But the Lord said to me, do not say I'm a youth, for you shall go to all whom I send you, and whatever I command you, you shall speak. What's God telling Jeremiah? I knew you were going to say you were a youth, but I also know that you will do my bidding. Since I called you, I knew before you in the womb that you would be willing to do my bidding.
Calvinists would probably use that same verse to turn it right around on and say, Jeremiah didn't have a choice in that because God said, whatever I command you, you're going to speak.
And that's what he would try to turn around. But here's foreknowledge. He's calling him as Jeremiah arguing, I don't want to do it. He says, I'm a youth. I'm not experienced. We see that in Moses.
That's why it's so hard to cherry pick verses when you're trying to prove your point, because the same scholars, and I mean, Calvin, we got to admit, Calvin was an extremely well-educated biblical scholar.
And
and so was Augustine before him, who we took most of that stuff from. Because that wasn't originated with Calvin, it originated with Augustine, maybe even before him. But anyway, you have to, like Stephen was saying, you have to read the Bible as a whole. It's written for a common man, and just make up your mind.
well,
Can I choose or not?
that's the point.
I have a choice.
Did Jeremiah have a choice?
I believe he did. The Calvinist believes he didn't, but I
But
believe
here
he
it
did.
comes again. With everything that we presented lined up, did they always have a choice?
Seems to me like that was.
And that's the point. If I cherry pick one verse to say this makes it happen, then I'm doing exactly what I said. But if I bring in a lot of verses that consistently show the same thing,
That's like the places where, which I can't remember where it is, but it says, if you do this, and if you do that.
all right. Well, we got through point one.
This is serious, not a single.
It it's something that if you try to do in one night, you do it injustice.
It's like the other pretty one.
Yeah, I mean, if we took the view like the Calvinist does and just says, well, God hardened Pharaoh's heart and not understand what God did in reference to that and look at those scriptures, then we're no better than they are. We'll fall into the same trap. The point is we have to take the time to really examine it. The problem with Calvin is he forgot a very important principle that I read last week, and I think it's good, and I don't know who the guy was that said it. I don't know whether or not he went to church, but he made this one statement. If I have a belief in God, and I read something in here that contradicts what I believe about God, I must assume I am wrong. Calvin chose, there's no way my belief is wrong, therefore I've got to find a way to justify it. But it's always, and people have said to me, and I've had people tell me, you're wrong about this. If you can show me here where I'm wrong, I'll change when I'm preaching. But you got to show me it here. What number did you choose?
915.
915. We all got a choice. We all got an opportunity. You need to respond. Come as we stand and sing.
When we walk with the Lord in the light of His word, what a glory He sheds on our way. While we do His good will, He abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey.
Our Father and our God, what an honor and a privilege it is to be your children and to come here and study from your word. Thank you for the